The cook, the thief, his wife, and her lover, which from now on I will refer to simply as the movie, is unpleasant. This is an extreme movie, not for everybody. Let's just make that clear before we go any further. This movie is unhinged. Don't blame me if you watch it and it blows your mind or you vomit. I don't have reviewers' insurance. Sorry. This is the first Peter Greenaway movie I've seen. I wish I had a way to watch all of his movies before reviewing the first one, but sadly, the time machine has not yet been invented. So bear with me as I try to piece together a somewhat puzzling film by maybe a somewhat puzzling director. Let's be clear, though. This is a great movie, a really interesting movie, unlike almost anything else. The Cook, the Thief, etc., reminds me of a joke called The Aristocrats. This is a movie set in a restaurant, mainly about the manager of the restaurant, who is a bit of a gangster. His name is Albert. This is Michael Gambon. Top Gear fans might know him well. Albert is one of the most unpleasant characters in all of cinema, I think. He sees himself as some kind of aristocrat, continuously lecturing on proper manners, but while simultaneously being boorish, slovenly, sordid, and violent. He's a bully and a menace to everything decent, to everything sacred. Albert's character and the specter of what he might do really is what drives large parts of the movie. The beginning of this movie, like much of the film, is bizarre. And at first, it's hard to tell what you're watching and what the shape of the movie is going to be. Once things get going, though, the basic structure of the plot is actually pretty simple. It centers around Albert and his wife, Georgina, played by Helen Mirren, who is cheating on him with a patron of the restaurant. Since Albert is so cruel, so violent, such a loose cannon, this is a somewhat terrifying scenario, and this simple mechanism is quite compelling. You really feel for Georgina and her lover, Michael, who's played by Alan Howard. Howard was in The Lord of the Rings, by the way. He played the voice of the Ring. There are a few other interesting people in this movie, like Tim Roth in one of his dimwit roles. So if this movie has a somewhat simple story at its core, a somewhat simple mechanism at its core, why am I saying that it's so extreme, unhinged, and different? Well, first of all, I'm only talking about the basic view of the plot being simple. There really is a lot of nuance to the story. But there's also really a lot of, what's the opposite of nuance? Crazy stuff, scatology, cannibalism, exhibitionism. The tone of this movie is wild. The style is also wild. It's a bit like a macabre Almodovar film. I know some Almodovar films are already macabre, but trust me, this is more macabre. Or maybe it's a bit like Mike Leigh, a Mike Leigh film on shrooms. In some ways, it doesn't really seem like a British film. It has French flair, maybe. But in other ways, I think it could only be a British film. Let me give you some details. The opening credits list a costume designer fairly prominently. At first, I wondered why this was. But as soon as the movie starts, you will understand. This is not, sometimes you watch movies, and it will say at the end, oh, Mr. De Niro's suits by so-and-so. And you think, what? I didn't even notice that he wore that. You don't even notice that there was costumes there. This is not like that. The costume design and the set design for this movie are remarkable. I said this film takes place mainly in a restaurant. I forgot to mention that it does not take place in reality. Partly, this feeling comes from the way the movie is shot. It's basically staged like an extremely elaborate play. We always see the sets from the same side, for instance, as if we were an audience. The camera often tracks sideways across the set. They use the shot again and again, kind of setting us up for it. The camera, when it tracks, it skips through walls as we go from one room to another, just like a play. The sets are huge and ornate. We have a kitchen that is partly out of some kind of steampunk fantasy. The food is all huge, exaggerated, vaudevillian. A blonde child washes dishes while singing opera in the kitchen. The film is underpinned by a great score from Michael Nyman. Each room in the film, each part of the set, has a very distinct style, mainly defined by dominating colors, lots of red, for instance, in the dining room. Often when actors move from one set to another, their wardrobe changes to match. Like I said, not a movie that takes place in reality exactly, but a remarkably ingenious movie. And some of the early scenes in particular will grasp you. I guarantee it. and pull you in. The way the music starts each sequence, really, like I said, great score. And the visuals, you track through the kitchen, you see the geese being plucked and their feathers drifting down from above. Overall, the imagery in this movie is insane, on the absolute highest level in terms of just visual dynamics, interest, ingenuity, and artistry. Honestly, I gotta say that the print that I got a hold of could have been a lot crisper. Maybe somebody can remaster this movie at some point. Anyway, I think you get the basic idea. A unique movie, but I guess not totally out of place with European cinema in the late 80s and early 90s. I already mentioned Almodovar. There's also Marc Caro and Jean-Pierre Jeunet. This movie came out 2 years before Delicatessen, which is a much more lighthearted movie. Feels kind of weird to say that, but in some ways it's similar. These are both very theatrical movies. There are a bunch of moments that feel more like an opera or a pantomime than a movie. For instance, when Albert is stalking through the kitchen looking for Georgina, he seems more like a shark or a bear than a person. He seems like a villain, almost in a vaudevillian sense. Meanwhile, Georgina and Michael are making love among a stand of oversized pastries. This is a movie with a lot of embellishment and a lot of choreography. Those things, embellishment, choreography, they feel kind of vaudevillian to me. They feel kind of theatrical to me. Really, though, I don't want to get too caught up in the style or the tone of this movie because anyone who watches it will instantly notice all of this stuff. Instead, let's think about something maybe deeper. I don't know. What's under the surface of this movie? On some level, I guess it's a story about tenderness and brutality. I'm not sure there's much of a moral there besides seeing how these things might stir in various parts of society, seeing how one might corrupt the other or something. You could also think about this movie as a satire of some kind of aristocrats. Like I said, this movie seems in some ways uniquely British. Albert obsesses over manners, but mainly he uses them as a weapon. The setting of the film in a restaurant, I guess, implies some kind of society, some kind of communal experience, but it's also a business. So we've got a few axes here. As a restaurateur, Albert, in theory, is standing up for some traditional values. He should believe in cuisine. This is not a McDonald's. It's a place with fancy, ornate dishes. Why do they do this? Why does it matter? In theory, he believes in something. While he often lectures his goons on fine dining, telling them about how important it is and what it is, his own taste seems to be a bit childish. Albert should also be an upstanding capitalist, given that he owns a business that is seemingly very successful. But he treats his clients terribly, doing things that would, in reality, destroy his business and his reputation instantaneously, like throwing out guests, making them eat in the kitchen, dumping soup on them. So you wonder, I guess, if this movie is in some ways alleging a level of gangsterism in British business and aristocratic culture, if this character of Albert is pointed, if it might be analogous to some real people. This is definitely not your average satire, though, because it's so brutal. And I wouldn't really even say, I mean, you could describe this as a dark comedy, I guess, but that doesn't quite seem right. Like I said, a brutal movie, but maybe it's in the ballpark of satire. Now, another thing that pops up a number of times is immigration. Albert does not like foreigners. He threatens his cooks with deportations. He slanders Ethiopians. He concludes that Georgina's lover is a Jew because his name is Michael, which is apparently a widely known Jewish name. Albert denigrates Michael constantly for this. This theme seems like one of the more pointed things in the movie in relation to the real world, this constant bringing up, this Albert getting stuck on immigration, on some sort of image of national purity, I guess. Again, you wonder if that's pointing to some real event. A slightly more vague theme in the movie is the idea of spoilage, the idea of something rotten. This goes hand in hand with decadence, I guess. And again, you wonder if this is some kind of comment on the real world. Like I said, I wouldn't call this a didactic movie, but it has some pointed moments. Okay, I want to mention a few of my favorite scenes from the film and some of the undercurrents that they bring up. First, we have a moment when Georgina comes to dinner with Albert, and when she sits down, you can see that she has bruises on her face and arms. This is already a loaded moment. The way the bruises are revealed is powerful. But then Albert steps out and leaves Georgina alone with his lackeys. and they don't really know what to say. Unsurprisingly, Albert has surrounded himself with questionable people, I guess. But how much are they shaped by him? When he's out of the room, they seem to have some empathy for Georgina. I guess it's kind of awkward. Are they terrible people? Or are they following a terrible leader? Or are they enabling terrible leadership? There's a question about society here, and a question about how things can decay and spoil, how rottenness can go from one person to another, how terrible organizations can be defined by bad leaders and also bad followers. I also want to give a mention to the cook, Richard, who I've yet to discuss, even though he is a great character and a big part of the movie. In fact, he's the first part of the title. Towards the end of the film, there is a late-night conversation between Richard and Georgina, and it's a beautifully sincere moment, full of uncertainty, longing, a really honest scene, even though what is being discussed is a bit ludicrous. That's one thing that I really like about this movie. None of the individual pieces make much sense. If you were to describe some of the climactic moments to someone, they would be a bit confused. But somehow the movie comes together as a whole and is powerful. Powerful and, I guess, nuanced. I'm still a little undecided on how much substance is truly here. At times, it feels profound, nuanced, but there are also a few elements that feel a little bit cheap. Like I said, in some ways, the basic structure of the plot is a little bit simplistic, and I guess a very harsh critique of the movie would be to say that it's arising out of some 80s gender war narrative that's a little bit brittle or something like that. I don't think I would say that exactly, but like I said, some of the mechanisms maybe are a little cheap. Overall, I gotta say, though, I really, really like this movie, partly because it's so far out of left field, and because it's so dynamic and so interesting to watch. I'm not totally sure how well this movie will have aged, what people will think about it now. Obviously, it's going to be a polarizing movie no matter what, and I think maybe in the 80s there was a little bit of a context, or in the 90s there's a little bit of context for this kind of sordid art house film that I'm not sure if exists anymore. I think audiences will still resonate with Georgina as the empathetic focal point of the movie, although there are aspects in which she leans into a certain cattiness that adds a little bit of a layer of complexity there, I guess. But Albert might just be too extreme, honestly, and some of his deeds might just go over the top. So I'm not really sure. I hesitate to recommend this movie because, like I said, it is extreme. This movie, I think, is rated NC-17, so don't watch it unless you have some idea about what you're getting into. But I wouldn't hesitate at all to say that The Cook, The Thief, etc., is really a cool movie in such that I don't actually have that much to say about it. The virtues are somewhat self-evident. There are some interesting themes under the surface here, but overall, I think maybe a movie just to experience for yourself.